Next friends, we're coming down to who is a banker and who is a customer. So a banker is any person who has a primary function of accepting deposits for some purpose of lending and investing, because that's what bankers do. They collect deposits and then they lend that money out for a certain rate of interest. Then any amount deposited is repayable on demand or according to the agreement, which is usually a time period. So all your fixed deposits, your RDs, etc., these are all something which you can deposit with the bank. So a banker is any person who does banking business, and a banking business is anything which consists of lending, borrowing, accepting deposits and repaying them on time. Now, who is a customer? A customer is a person who is generally a person who is in relation to banking, a person who has a bank account with the bank. So the relationship between a banker and a customer is what we call as the customer's relationship. So a banker has certain duties to the customers. They have to honor all their checks, collect checks and drafts on their behalf, keep proper record of their transactions, comply with all of the instructions of the customer, don't disclose the accounts to anyone unless it is the government and proper order has come. Reasonable notice should be given to the customer in case the banker is going to close the bank. They have a right of lien over the general balance of the account. They have set off and rights of appropriation and certain other charges they can claim for providing services to you as a bank. Now, a banker has certain liabilities. Generally, we will say that a banker is liable to the debtor or to the customer to the extent of money that's there in the account. So, if I have 10 lakh rupees in my account, then my bank is liable only to the extent of the 10 lakh rupees in my account. The bank is not going to pay for my 1 crore loan that I may have, but rather only the amount in my account or my fixed deposits. This is the first aspect of it. The second is, in case I have suffered any losses or damages because my banker didn't do certain actions, then he is liable to compensate me for the same. If I had given clear and express standing instruction to cancel the check, and my banker did not cancel the check but went ahead to honor it, and it had caused irreparable damage to me, then the banker has to pay me or compensate me for the same. So this is the second liability of the banker. The third thing is that he must maintain proper records and accounts of my statements. Proper accounts of credit, debit, etc. must all be properly maintained. A banker must do a certain activity. In some situations, he has to refuse payment, but in certain other situations, the banker may refuse payment. So let's look at both of the transactions. When is the banker compulsorily required to refuse the payment? If someone comes and gives a check, he should not honor it. For example, if the customer has given clear instruction not to honor the check, then the banker must not honor the check. So say for example, if I give a standing instruction to say that this check is cancelled, the check is cancelled. If the customer is dead, if the customer is declared as insolvent, if the customer has been declared of, the banker has been given notice of the customer's insanity. In these three situations, no transactions must take place after that. Then a garnishee order. A garnishee order is usually given by the court, and during the pendency of certain proceedings before the court, sometimes persons will transact with their bank accounts. If it feels like they are trying to push away money or alienate the money in their account, the court can give a garnishee order prohibiting the bank to make any payment of money to anyone. Then, if the customer has assigned the credit balance of his account to a third person, then the bank will not honor any instructions given by the customer himself, where the customer's title is defective or the holder's title is defective and the banker comes to know of it. So someone has fraudulently received a check, the banker will not honor it, and where the customer has closed his account. So these are situations in which the banker must refuse payment. Now, when can a banker choose to refuse payment. One, check is post dated. The funds are not sufficient in the account and there is no communication between bank and customer to honor the check. Check is doubtful of its legality. Check is not presented within the proper time, that it is given after banking hours. If it is altered, ambiguous, irregular, not properly written, etc. Presented at a branch where customer doesn't have any account. Joint checks and the check is not signed by the joint owner, or the check has become stale in the sense that it is not presented within the 6-month due date. These are all situations which can be rectified. That means the banker can say, okay, this is not properly written, write the correct thing and give the check to me. Or these are situations where the banker may say, I'm giving you a chance to alter the same income. But where it is compulsory to refuse payment, there is no chance of rectification. So now that we've seen who a banker is, what his liability to the customer is, when must he refuse payment and when he has a choice to refuse payment, we now have to look at the protection of the banker itself. Now, a banker cannot always be expected to know all the signatures of every person in the world, and a check is usually signed by the maker. He may know his own customers' signatures, but he cannot be expected to know everyone else's signatures. And also, even if he knows his customers' signatures, he can check to a certain extent whether it is similar. So if someone has forged an instrument, a banker cannot always be expected to know whether it was a forgery or not, because it is presumed that he will take some due care in presenting or honoring the check. And if by chance there is a forged signature or a forged check and the banker makes out a payment as a result of the same, then the banker will not be held liable for this. So therefore, a forgery of a drawer's signature will not ordinarily protect the banker, but even in this case, the banker may debit the account of the customer if it was shown that the forgery was intimately connected to the negligence of the customer and was the proximate cause of loss. This is because a forgery is expected to be known by the banker, but they're saying that eventually even the bank should take certain due care at the time of making or honoring the payments. So let's look at who the collecting banker is. The collecting banker is the one who eventually makes the payment of money to the customer. Okay, he is the one who will eventually collect the check, honor it, and then make the payment in case the amount is there in the customer's account. Here also the banker is not expected to know all the signatures unless it is his own customer signature. While the collecting banker does not have a lot of liability, he does not have a lot of duty, because a collecting banker, once presented with the check, is presumed to or is required to actually honor it if all the other requirements are properly done. But then in 2002, an amendment act came out to a section number 131, which said that the banker now has a duty to verify the genuineness of the check, and it must be genuine on the face of it from fraud, forgery, tampering, etc. And it must be verified with due diligence and care. So he cannot simply say that, no, I had no knowledge of it, but he must take the extra effort to actually verify the genuineness of the check. The protection will be given to the collecting banker if he has acted in good faith and without negligence. If the banker has collected a crossed check, that is, the check should have been given or crossed before it came to him for collection. The proceeds should have been collected for a customer of the bank only, and the collecting banker should have acted as an agent for the customer. So this is what we call as the protection of the collecting banker. What do we understand by overdue, stale or out of date checks? It's very simple. A check becomes overdue or stale generally within 6 months, after 6 months itself they will not accept it for payment, but it becomes statute barred within 3 years. That is, the 3 years period is also what we call as the limitation period. But then if it has been in circulation for more than 6 months time, it is regarded by bankers as stale, and presenting a check post 6 months will not be considered as a valid check. Now, whenever we have a check, we have certain modes of crossing a check. There is something known as a general crossing as well as a special crossing. What is a general crossing? It consists of two parallel transverse lines in addition to the words "and co" or "not negotiable." So, it will simply have two lines like this. When there are two lines, it is presumed that the paying banker will pay to any banker. So, any other bank has the option of paying out this amount of money. But then a special crossing is that in addition to the name of the banker, it will have again two lines crossed like this, but written only to the account of the person. Okay, so the paying banker in this situation will pay only to the banker who appears on the check. So while it is a general crossing, any bank can pay out. I can go to any bank and ask for money, and that is what we call as the payment system. But then in special crossing, only two banks will be in transaction. If I've issued an ICICI bank check, you can only go to the bank of Kotak Bank and specifically get your thing from there. So normally what happens in today's transactions is that the check amount will always come only into your bank account. It won't actually be handed out to you as cash. And once it comes into your account, then we know that whoever's encashed the check has gotten into his account only and not any other account. A not negotiable crossing is also a third type of crossing, which actually reduces the effect of negotiability. Because remember, all bills of exchange, checks and promissory notes are negotiable. They are easily transferable through delivery and endorsement. Now, if we want to prevent the negotiability, that means once I have given it to a person, I don't want anyone else to be transacting with me. So when I want to stop the negotiability of that check, I can cross it by writing the words "not negotiable" in two transverse lines. So I will draw two lines and say "not negotiable." Okay, the purpose of crossing a check as "not negotiable" is purely to make it non-transferable. Okay, the check is valid, it just cannot be transferred. The maturity of most checks, as we have already said, can be made payable on a specified date or after a specified time. So a maturity is always when it becomes due for payment. Now let's come to the concept of dishonor and its remedies. A dishonor is when a promissory note, bill of exchange or check is said to be dishonored by non-payment when the party, that is the maker of the bill, etc., has defaulted in the payment required to be done. So there is some kind of a default in payment, and when there is a default, we say that there is a dishonor. Now, what is the process of dishonor? Please note that as soon as there is a dishonor of check, notice must be given to the other party. Generally, they will say that as soon as the dishonor, the non-payment happens, or the check has been given for acceptance and rejected because insufficient funds or some other reason, it does not automatically attract the provisions of punishment, but rather first the acceptor has to give notice to the maker, and once notice is given, the maker should be capable of rectifying the situation, issuing a new check or rectifying it in such a way where the payment is completed. But in case even after giving notice the parties don't do anything, we go through a process known as noting. And if noting post noting, we can also go for something known as a protest. So let's look at what do you mean by notice of dishonor. They're saying that whenever a negotiable instrument is dishonored, okay, the other party must give notice to all the parties who he seems to make liable. Okay, once he has given notice, he must try to rectify the situation within a reasonable period of time. So let's say, for example, that I have received a check, I go and encash it, and it has been returned due to insufficient funds. What I have to do is I have to inform the person who gave me the check, and I have to give them 15 days time to rectify the situation. If I am due 5 lakh rupees, then they may either make the payment of 5 lakh rupees through a NEFT transfer or an RTGS transfer, or they might even issue a new check to me. So this period of notice is so that we can rectify the situation. But if it is not actually rectified within the correct time, then we can go on to the next process. The next process is known as noting and protest. Noting is, they're saying again, when a note or a bill is dishonored, the holder is entitled, after giving due notice, that is, after dishonor, the notice has also been done, then at that time, the holder can approach the notary public and ask the notary public to note it down on the instrument saying that this instrument has been dishonored. Now, why we do this is because it's to give a certain amount of authenticity to the action of dishonor. And when it is recorded by the notary public within a reasonable period, then it can even be given as a proper evidence should you go to the court of law. So the purpose of noting is to actually literally note down the fact that there has been a dishonor of the check or the promissory note. Whereas protest is a formal, again, notarial certificate. After dishonor, there is notice. After notice, there is the process of noting, and after noting, a formal protest is drawn up by the notary, where it relates back to the date of the noting itself. So in such a situation, the holder may have, the purpose of protesting is that they are saying that, see, I am protesting this current check, I want you to give me a fresh check to make good on the security. So say for example, we will always say that once a check is given, the first time it is accepted, the validity of it comes to an end. Now the problem is I went and gave it for acceptance, but it got returned to me. Now can I use that check again? Is it possible for me to reuse the same check to withdraw the money? No, I have to get a fresh and better security. I have to get a fresh check for that purpose. So the process of protesting is saying that I want a fresh check to make good for the dishonor that you have committed. So that is why we said there is always, whenever there is a dishonor, it is not completed until notice has been given and the party has done nothing to rectify the situation. If he has rectified it, there is no problem. But if he hasn't rectified it, I will go formally to a notary and I will get it noted and protested and demand for a new security. Our next concept is discharge of negotiable instruments. Our instruments can only be discharged either by parties themselves or once the instrument's purpose comes to an end. Now say for example a check was given from A to B for the tune of 50,000 rupees. B encashes the check, okay, and he receives the 50,000. Now this check has now been discharged. Like I said, one time only. The purpose of the instrument is to be used only once, and once it is used, the discharge is already completed. But we can even discharge one or more parties here. Let's take the same example. A gives a check to B, or let's not use the word check, let's use the word promissory note for better example. Gives the promissory note to B, but then B ends up transferring the promissory note by endorsement and delivery to C. Now over here, B gets discharged from the liability of this instrument, and A will have to pay directly to C. So discharge can happen of the instrument itself or of the parties to the instrument. When does the instrument get discharged? When the payment is eventually completed. When the principal debtor becomes the holder. Let me give you an example for this. Let's take the same example as we have above over here. A is a trader. He does credit sales of goods to B. The period is 45 days for the payment of money for goods sold. Now A wishes to have some kind of security to ensure that if B does not pay within 45 days, that he has recourse to some security. So what A will do is, A will ask for a promissory note from B. Okay. Now over here, who is B? B becomes the principal debtor, because he is the one who owes money to A. He has to give it within 45 days, but he is still the principal debtor. Now let's assume that B makes the payment within the required period of time. He makes payments every 45 days and business is going properly. Now A and B have completed their business transactions. A will never actually, there is no encashment over here, because it's only a security. Only if B does not make payment to him, he will go and enforce for the promissory note. But then what if since B is making all of the payments, A will return the promissory note back to B, saying that you made all the payments to me, I am not going to encash this anytime. So has B, being the principal debtor, now become the holder of the instrument itself? At that point, the validity of the instrument is no longer there. By an act that would discharge a simple contract, by renunciation or by cancellation. Either person gives up the instrument or it gets cancelled due to certain other reasons. Whereas discharge by parties is when the cancellation by the holder is the one who cancels or erases off the name of the person involved in one of the transactions. By releasing any one party to the instrument, releasing any endorsers to the instrument by operation of law, by allowing a drawee more than 48 hours to accept the bill, by non-presentment of a check promptly within the time, by qualified acceptance, and by material alteration. Now let's look at what is material alteration. Material alteration is anything which completely alters the operation of the instruments and the liabilities of the parties. A material alteration is void. So any kind of material alteration should not be accepted as a proper instrument. There is no material alteration in case there is a correction of mistake, to carry out some common intention of parties. Alteration is made with the consent of parties before the instrument itself is issued, by crossing of a check and adding the words on demand in case it is no time is required for the payment of the instrument. Friends, the next type of bills of exchange and promissory notes, I won't call it a type, but apart from bills of exchange and promissory notes, there is one more thing known as hundis. Hundis are actually a form of a bill of exchange only. We'll call this as a native bill of exchange. Okay, and they are actually used are governed by our customs and usages, because the hundis were in circulation in India long before the Negotiable Instruments Act even came out. So what are they? They are types of negotiable instruments where they can be either bills of exchange or promissory notes. An instrument, in order to be a hundi, is capable of being sued by the holder in his own name and must be capable of transfer like cash by delivery. So the purpose over here is actually to transfer it as if you are transferring cash. What are the types of hundis? We have Shahjog hundi. A Shah refers to a person who is a respectable man, or a person who has acquired goodwill in society. So a person, Shahjog hundi refers to a person or a hundi which is made payable only to a respectable holder as compared to a bearer. So when you give it to someone who has good standing and respect in society, we call that as a Shahjog hundi. A Jokmi hundi is always drawn on or against goods shipped on a vessel. It's saying that only when the goods arrive through ship and the goods have actually been received, only then money will be paid out. So it's something like an insurance policy. A Jawabi hundi. Okay, a Jawabi hundi is something where it is a method where it is used for remitting money from one place to another. Think of it like our bank itself, where we do bank transfers, but then over here what we do is a person that wishes to make the remittance. So say for example that I wish to make a certain amount of payment to someone in Delhi. So the payee over here is in Delhi. What do? I go and give a letter to a banker, and that banker will endorse it, and he will transfer that particular that hundi to the payee. The payee will also give a receipt in form of an answer, and then based on that person will receive a money from their side. So the purpose is over here to transfer money from one end to the other is only known as Jawabi hundi. A Namjog hundi refers to a hundi which is payable to a person named in the bill or to his order. Okay, so the name of the payee is specifically inserted over here, and it can be negotiated like a bill of exchange. Its alteration into a Shahjog hundi is a material alteration and renders it void. So a Namjog hundi refers to nothing other than a name being presented in the hundi. A Darshani hundi is something which is payable on sight. Again, freely negotiable, but price is usually it increases up and down. It must be paid within a reasonable time, and they are received by the holder. A Mayadi hundi, or also known as a Mudati hundi, is one which is payable after a specified period of time. This is this form of like an advance payment, like after an advance is taken out and deducted, the rest of the money is paid. A Danijog hundi refers to a person where the owner himself. So he himself is the hundi which is payable to the owner himself, and the last hundi is Firmanjog hundi, which is payable to order if negotiated by endorsement and delivery. So we've already seen an endorsement and delivery is simply signing on it and then delivering it to the other person. Our next concept is known as presumptions in law. So there are always some presumptions with respect to negotiable instruments. Let's look at them. Every negotiable instrument was always made for some consideration, irrespective of whether the amount is mentioned in the consideration or not. Remember, we've spoken that negotiable instruments are usually done for some kind of a consideration. That every negotiable instrument having a date, it was made on that date itself. So if I write a check with today's date, but then actually I wrote the check yesterday, but then I dated it to today, that and all doesn't matter. It's presumed that the date on which is mentioned in the instrument is the day on which it was actually made. Every accepted bill of exchange is presumed to be accepted within its maturity period, and this is the favor of presumption. If it was actually not accepted before its maturity, then the other party will have to prove otherwise. That in case a negotiable instrument was transferred, it was transferred before its maturity, and the instruments were endorsed in the order in which they appear on it. Remember, I said that an instrument can be transferred multiple times. So we will be able to see who is the original holder, who bought it from him after that, and who after that, who after that. We will be able to see the transaction of events by endorsement. A lost or destroyed instrument was actually properly signed and stamped. What do we mean by this? Sometimes many people will say that they will simply come and say that I have lost the instrument, and they will simply claim for a fresh one. Now the rules state that where you have lost the original instrument and you wish to acquire a duplicate or a fresh one, you don't have to pay a fresh stamp duty on it. Okay. Now this led to multiple loopholes where many people will simply not pay stamp duty, go and claim that their instrument was lost, and then come out with a fresh instrument without having to pay stamp duty. But these are all fraudulent transactions. We can't presume that everyone does the same thing. So the presumption is always that in case there was an instrument which was lost or destroyed, we'll presume that that instrument had a proper sign and it was also duly stamped. The holder of the instrument is the holder in due course. Whoever is the person now with the instrument has acquired it in good faith and for a consideration. In a suit upon an instrument any instrument which has been dishonored, the court will always presume the fact of dishonor or the proof of protest. Okay, these are all legal presumptions, and we have already studied under evidence law that where there is a presumption, other parties can come and prove evidence to, give evidence to prove it otherwise. So they are always rebuttable by evidence to the contrary. And now the burden of proving will fall on the other party and not the plaintiff. So usually the plaintiff is the one who will have to prove whatever he is alleging. But in this case, the defendant will have to prove that it was not duly signed, or it was not duly stamped, or that the holder is not actually the holder in due course, that the court actually honored a check beyond its maturity period, etc. The last concept is dishonor of check for insufficiency of funds. So this is what we talk about as section 138 of the Negotiable Instruments Act. Now section 138 is saying that if a customer to the account, where a check is drawn by a person on an account maintained by him, so where a customer has asked the banker for the payment of some amount of money to another person, then, and it is for the purpose of discharging some kind of a debt or a liability, but then the banker dishonored the same. Now this dishonor could have happened either so if any customer has asked his banker to make some amount of payment to another person out of his account for the purpose of any kind of debt or liability, but that check is returned because the money is insufficient to honor the check. In short, there is insufficient funds. Then they are saying that such a person shall be deemed to have committed an offence which shall be punishable with an imprisonment term which may extend up to 2 years, a fine which can be 2 times the amount, or both. So friends, understand that even though this is a civil law, a dishonor of check, specifically only a check, can amount to a criminal offence. They are not talking about dishonor of a promissory note or a dishonor of any kind of a bill of exchange. They are specifically talking about checks, and it specifically gets dishonored because there are no funds in the account, not because of the other reasons. In this case, a person will be liable to imprisonment up to 2 years or fine twice the amount, or both. But please remember that the punishment doesn't happen immediately. It happens only after the following conditions are actually followed. First, the check should be presented within 6 months' time. That is within the validity period. So if he went beyond the 6 months time, then the person issuing the check has no reason to keep that amount in his account anymore. And we know that many businesses have money constantly coming in and going out of the accounts. Since we have issued a check, the good practice is usually to keep that amount in the account until he encashes the same. But anything beyond 6 months time, I have no duty to maintain that in my account. So only after the check has been presented within the 6-month period, the holder in due course or the payee should have made a demand to the drawer. That is, he must have notified the drawer and give him an information saying that, see, your check has been dishonored. And you have to give him 30 days time to actually make good on the payment. So if he can make a payment through a NEFT transaction, or if he can even issue a fresh check, then you're giving him a certain amount of time to make good on that dishonor. But if he fails to make good on the amount due, or within 15 days of receipt of the notice, then and only then can we say that this rule applies, or this liability comes into existence. But otherwise, it is not an immediate provision. Only once the following conditions have been allowed or have been followed, only then the penalty amount will apply under section 138. Now, by chance, if a person has been convicted under section 138, then the offence is to be tried by a judicial magistrate of first class or by a metropolitan magistrate. Please note that as per the new criminal laws, the BNS and the BNSS, we don't have metropolitan magistrates anymore. It will be tried by the chief judicial magistrate. Now, conviction in a summary trial is that it cannot exceed a term of 1 year and a fine exceeding 5,000 rupees. So, in summary trials, the maximum imprisonment given can only be 1 year. These offences are compoundable, and it is to be compounded in accordance with our criminal laws. Friends, the last topic is with regards to NEFT and RTGS transactions, because even though we've been studying about bills of exchange, promissory notes and checks, in today's world we are seeing the movement or the advent of faster internet banking channels. So most of us do not actually transact in checks many times. We'd rather refer to a NEFT transaction or an RTGS transaction. They are both transactions in which money is sent from one account to the other by giving certain kind of instructions. Generally, they'll say that NEFT transactions are for an amount of up to 2 lakh rupees, whereas RTGS is for any amount greater than 2 lakh rupees. It is always done only on the order of the individual. It doesn't happen automatically. So you need to give the necessary instructions to conduct a NEFT and RTGS transaction. What is the advantage of a NEFT transaction? It can be done on all days of the year, and it's not limited to just the banking days. They transfer money to the beneficiary account, and that transfer takes place in a very secure manner. It has a pan-India coverage. Beneficiary does not even need to visit the bank itself. They can simply remit from their home. Confirmations usually sent by SMS, email, etc. And in case of return of transactions or any such thing, there are penal interests. No charges to the saving bank of account to the account of customers for online NEFT transactions. And RTGS, we can see that it is a safe transaction. There is no cap for RTGS transactions. The system is available on all days, and again, physical check or demand draft is not required. However, if parties require, they can even go to the bank, submit a physical check and do an RTGS transaction. So friends, this comes to the end of your Negotiable Instruments Act, and also the very end of your fast track course under jurisprudence subject of CS Executive.